Welcome back to another episode of Storytime with Chantastic, where we explore the tools and process of modern UI development. And today we have an awesome guest. We have Tom Preston-Werner, who you might know from co-founding GitHub or semantic versioning, which we all use every day of our life. We're concerning ourselves with semantic versioning. So Tom, how are you today?
I'm well, thank you. Happy to be here.
So I want to dive right into the meat of what we're talking about today, which is just the future of full stack frameworks. And over the last couple years, you've been developing with a team, RedwoodJS. And so just tell me a little bit about, like, I mean, I guess why you would take on such a behemoth task of developing a new framework. Like, what did you want to achieve?
Yeah, well, let me first tell you a little bit about what Redwood is, which might help inform why it exists. So
Yeah.
The way that I think about Redwood is that it's a JavaScript and TypeScript web framework designed to help you scale from side project to startup. So we really envision taking you all the way, which is why Redwood has become such a sophisticated framework. It has taken us now 2 years to build it to the point where we're nearing a 1.0 release. And that's what it's about for me. It's about enabling people to build what they want to build in an easier way and integrating more technologies in there from the beginning so you have less work to do as you build your startup.
I really like that idea, side project to startup. How long did it take you to kind of iron out that little pitch? It's pretty good.
Well, it's funny. Redwood didn't really start that way. The beginnings of Redwood come from my involvement in Netlify. I'm currently on the Netlify board. But before I've been an investor in Netlify since the very beginning, so it's always been interesting to me. And having authored Jekyll in my distant past, the idea of static site generators and the Jamstack and how that has evolved has always been really interesting to me. And when Netlify made it really easy to deploy Lambda functions along with your statically generated sites, that made me think that it might be possible to create full stack web applications with that same architecture by deploying your business logic onto Lambdas and your front end onto their CDN. And so if you have a single page app framework, you might be able to pull that off, and then you'd hook it up with some database in the backend that you get from somewhere. And I thought that would be a cool architecture, and that might be a really neat use case for Netlify. And so nobody seemed to be building anything that looked like that. And so I started noodling on it. And then I met Peter Pistorius, one of the co-creators of Redwood, at a company that I was working at before. And we started building it. And it became Redwood. And it's evolved over the last couple of years now to be less about, back then we called it full stack on the Jamstack. Mm-hmm. It turns out that it's still a little bit hard to deploy a full application into a single Lambda. It's a bit of an abuse of what Lambdas are. And so we've been building other deploy targets so you can deploy it to render or onto AWS or to Vercel. So there's lots of different places that you can deploy a Redwood app now. And it's become less about that specifically, about trying to sort of wrangle the Jamstack in this specific way. I think we still have to wait a little bit for some of the technologies to evolve to achieve that dream. I think we will eventually. I think we'll eventually get there. But in the meantime, what I found was that people who were ambitious were choosing Redwood because it already included the types of things that they knew that they were going to need. So for instance, Storybook, Jest, it's GraphQL, it's based on GraphQL. So from the very beginning, you have an API that can serve not only a web application, but also a mobile application or a command line tool. So just taking some of these architectural principles that I learned at GitHub and companies after, and through my experiences in maintaining software over long periods of time, and trying to codify and bake those patterns into a framework that was going to make it easy to go for the long haul.
Yeah, so I really want to touch into your experience, but like before we kind of dive into your experience in Rails and how that kind of informed some of the decisions that that you have for Redwood, I'm curious, like the transition from full stack for Jamstack to what you're doing right now, which is the JS app framework for startups, it is really interesting. And I'm curious, like in that time, have you kind of like backed off of specifically Jamstack? Like is Redwood now kind of serverless or server full, I guess is maybe the other term for that.
Server anything. Yeah, yes. And that's kind of because if you wanted a specific kind of performance, it's been hard to get that out of lambdas. Just lambdas are not
Interesting.
really optimized for the kind of thing that we're doing with Redwood currently. I had anticipated that AWS would take Lambda and really like push it more towards lightweight containerization, that it would feel more like that. And it really
Interesting.
hasn't. And so given that realization and that reality, then it's like, okay, well, what are the other ways that you could deploy this? And depending on your use case, for a lot of use cases, Vercel and Netlify are really amazing choices, and you can deploy Redwood there, and it works great, and it's cheap, and it's always available, and you can put it up, and you never have to worry about it or maintain it, and it's rock solid and it's perfect. In other circumstances, that's not the case, and so really it depends on what you're doing. And one of the beautiful things that's arisen out of this architecture that started with the Jamstack is that you can take something that is architected in a Jamstacky kind of a way, and you can put it onto a regular set of servers, and it works with almost no changes.
Hmm.
And so it creates this really excellent adaptability across deployment providers. So you can take an app that you designed to be deployed onto Netlify, and in a matter of a couple of minutes, you can have that deployed onto AWS in a completely different environment with almost no code changes at all.
Sorry for the little break. You're going to get a different view of me. Camera battery exhausted again. So, fun times with technology. Now, one thing I want to ask is you have this new tagline which is ship today with architecture for tomorrow. And I'm curious, with as broad as the kind of term Jamstack is, what are some of the pillars of like future architecture that you see? So if it's not just serverless functions anymore, what are some of those key pillars that you keep going towards inside of Redwood?
Well, I think it has become about that kind of adaptability, in that you want your tools to match the job that you're asking them to do. And if your framework can adapt between both a serverless and a more traditional server full environment, then that gives you the flexibility to start very cheaply, very easily, deploy to Netlify or Vercel. And then if you need performance characteristics that you can't be met there because of just the nature of Lambda or these other serverless technologies, given what you're trying to have them do, then you can easily move over to something that does in a serverful environment. And that's not something that you can get with most frameworks. And it's something that the Redwood architecture makes possible, sort of by happenstance, but it's something that we've been able to embrace after we sort of came to terms with Jamstack maybe not the current infrastructure that's available for a Jamstacky full stack thing, which given, it's a weird thing to try to do, right? Like it was an experiment.
Yeah.
Redwood really started as an experiment. It's like, can I make this work? And the answer
Yeah.
is yes, kind of, depending. And so now we look at the technology and we say, okay, well, what problems is it solving and how can we further optimize it to solve those problems? It's, we act in a very startup-y way. Redwood itself is not currently a startup, but I do pay several people to work on it full time. And so it is essentially a startup. It's sort of a hybrid between a startup and an open source project, which I love. It's kind of my favorite way to work. It makes it really fun. It's, you don't have the pressures of it being a fully fledged startup, and we can really focus on the community and building the thing that's right without having to worry too much about like, how are we going to extract some kind of cost out of the community.
Yeah.
I wouldn't mind if that happened eventually, if we were to create a sustainable model for Redwood to where I wasn't having to pay for it out of my own pocket. But I have the privileged capability to do that, and it gives me a lot of joy. And so I'm very happy to do it. And I just really want Redwood to be what Redwood is supposed to be without bringing in some of these other aspects until they come naturally. Maybe we'll build some services around it or something else. But in the meantime, we operate as this weird hybrid between startup mentality and open source mentality.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see that kind of transition from experiment where you're playing against the technology and then finding that fit for the type of person that you want to use Redwood. And as I was going through some of your marketing, it seems a lot more geared towards that flexibility that you mentioned, to kind of not think about the technology first, but think about the product or the job first, dive in and know that Redwood is going to follow you wherever you need to go. And I think that's really awesome. And I think it flies kind of in like competition too, I guess, or like it's very different from a lot of the other frameworks that I've seen in the space, which feel very like technology focused, right? Like they're technology first. Like, I want to use this technology. How can I possibly do that? And so it's a really interesting differentiator. I want to talk about your experience with Rails, because obviously you built a massive product on top of Rails, and kind of how that fits into this mindset of like a product first mindset. And specifically, I want to ask you, what are some of the things that are kind of missing in the scope of front-end frameworks today that you got, over the last 20 years using a full stack framework like Rails?
Rails, first, let me say Rails is amazing. Rails is how I am who I am today. It really leveled up my career. When I started working with Rails, it's all I wanted to do. I was I got into Ruby early and started with Rails 0.11 or something. So it was within the first year or so of Rails's existence, and met so many people in the community there that helped me level up and got me to San Francisco. And we started building GitHub on Rails because that's what I knew. That's what we all knew. And it was beautiful. It's a great framework. It still is a great framework. The reasons that I don't use Rails anymore are for a couple of reasons. One is Rails started to feel like a lot of magic to me. I mean, this was even back in GitHub days. And initially when we started GitHub, Chris, one of the co-founders, Chris Wonstroth, was deep into the Rails side. I was actually growing a little bit tired of writing Rails because of the kind of the magic of it and the front-endiness of it. And I wanted to focus on the back end. So I wrote the parts of GitHub initially. I did the front-end design, like the visual, the UX design. And then I did the library on the back end that would talk to the Git repositories on disk. So it was the first Ruby client for Git. It was called Grit.
Cool.
It's no longer in use. It was deprecated. There are better ways to do that now in Ruby, but this was the first thing that ever did that. And it was because I could write pure Ruby, and I loved that. I love not having to worry about all the metaprogramming and magic that kind of Rails espoused. And you're kind of like, how does this work? I have no idea. Things are a little more magical than I really wanted them to be. So part of it is that I was just not super enthusiastic about that kind of complexity and how that magic creeped in. And so over the years then, we're still building with Rails. Rails was still the best solution. 5 years ago when I started building Chatterbug with Scott, who is another ex-GitHub co-founder, we went and we started a company called Chatterbug that is a language learning startup. And so we used Rails there because, again, that's what we knew. But then we started using React on the front end because React is amazing and one-way data flows and everything that React gives you, which we loved. But it starts to then be a little weird with Rails when you start mixing React and Rails, and you're like, all right, I'm going to start hooking React into specific places on the page, and now I'm mounting React in 3 different locations, and I guess I'll just pull the data and provide a JSON structure to feed into these various React components.
Yep.
And then you start wondering, why am I doing this? Why am I using Rails as, if I'm going to throw away pretty much all the front end stuff of Rails, then why am I writing 2 different languages? Why am I not writing JavaScript on the back end as well? You start to the context switching. But then I guess there's one more phase that I forgot to say, which is we started converting things to GraphQL, because then we could use data fetching and sort of asynchronous loading on the front end, because we also had a mobile application. And so the mobile application wanted to consume only GraphQL. So then we're like, well, what if the web front end also was consuming GraphQL in the same kind of way? So now we've got React and GraphQL being fed by GraphQL on top of Rails. And
Yeah.
then we're like, well, what is even like why like it's you start eating JavaScript, kind of further
Right.
back and using these React centric models in GraphQL. And so that was also part of where Redwood came from, which is like, why don't I just write JavaScript everywhere? Like, we have things like Apollo on the back end to create a GraphQL server. And if we can establish patterns and choose technologies and build it into a framework, then we can stop doing all the grunt work that we've had to do at Chatterbug, which was extensive to
Yeah.
build, it's like everyone who builds a React application is essentially building their own framework. And so there's like thousands and thousands and thousands of badly done, unmaintained frameworks that people use in their companies because you're not supposed to be building a framework, you're supposed to be building your application. And so you build as much of a framework as you need to get the job done, but it's never done as well as you want because you can't justify spending all that time integrating things perfectly and making sure that everything works together as well as you want, right? So this was kind of the status quo as of 2 years ago. Everybody's building their own framework badly. And so were we. We were building that same kind of thing, except with, React up until it's GraphQL, and that's built on Rails. And so that was the idea. Can we build a JavaScript framework that codifies the things that we were learning at Chatterbug and building an application with two clients, a web client and a mobile client, and also meet these ideas I had around full stack for Jamstack. And so that's really where Redwood was born and where we started to diverge completely from Rails to say, now you can use a single language. You can use JavaScript or TypeScript from front to back. And isn't that nice? Like that's a really nice aspect. And it's also for startups that are hiring to be able to go out there and hire developers that are writing a single language is always nicer than having to hire two different kinds of developers. And then they have a hard time crossing over from front end to back end between the two. You can't have your front end developers working on the back end as easily or vice versa because their minds are working in one language, and it's just uncommon to have people that are cross front end back end. I mean, they're out there, they're amazing. I'll hire them anytime that I have the chance, but there are not as many of those as there are specialized front end and back end people that are working in their own languages and technologies. But having someone that can write JavaScript or TypeScript across the front end and the back end, you can start creeping into each other's territory a lot more easily. And I find that to be a really desirable aspect as well. So that's a bit of the history of me and Rails. And Rails is still amazing. I think Rails is still a great choice for certain applications. It's always about finding the right tool for the job.
For sure. Now, one of the things that Rails handles really well for you is things like jobs and mailers and things like that. So, which has been kind of maybe some of the kind of like unsung value of Rails. Obviously, we have Prisma, which is a great ORM for database calls. What does it look like in modern front end apps to use like Jamstack for services like that, for like the mailers and the job queuing side of things?
Yeah, well, in the Jamstack universe, you're relying on some of these plug and play types of services a lot more. So being able to rely on third-party mailing APIs is a lot more common. So you're calling out to those more directly. But yeah, you're still wanting to do a lot of these things from queues. And that in a serverless environment is a bit trickier in the Jamstack kind of way. It's like, well, how do you do scheduled jobs? So Netlify now has some technology to do that directly. You can use the queuing services that are part of Netlify. One of our core guys, Rob Cameron, wrote one called Repeater, repeater.dev, which is a simple queuing service that you can call out to. So you can check that out if you're looking for that type of a thing. It can do both cron job style things or just a delayed job, like run this as soon as you can, just do it, in the background. And all that does is put into a queue in the Repeater service something that then makes a call back to the application. And in Redwood, you can create custom functions. So you have the GraphQL API, which is one function. And then you can create as many other custom functions as you want to respond to things like that or webhooks. And so that then just makes a call back into your application to then run whatever it is, giving it the payload. So it does come back and run in your application. It's just orchestrated by another service that's running outside of it. So this composition of services is really common in Jamstack. So
Yeah.
if you want to do a Jamstack architecture, then that's a really nice way to do it.
Interesting. Now, it sounds to me like in the Jamstack, there's a lot more focus on integration. So you have a lot of services that have integrations like this. So the Netlify scheduling service. I'm curious, as a framework developer, does that kind of change the way that you think about building frameworks? I feel like one of the advantages of Rails, or even like, you know, other frameworks like Laravel and whatnot, there was this assumption that they had a, you know, they were going to be run on a server, and so there's a class of things that you kind of like get for free with that. But then now the server, I guess in a lot of serverless applications, ends up being kind of like a more like an opinionated service. How much does that creep into the amount of work that you all have to do at the framework level?
Well, I think it's important to note also that, as we've mentioned many times, Redwood is not just a serverless environment.
Sure.
So I would imagine that as we move forward, once we get past 1.0, some of these things I would love to see in the framework itself, so that you didn't have to use external services if you were going to use a server-full environment to be able to do the things that delay job or action mailer, the different services, the different built-in components that you might be using with Rails, doing those types of things if you have a full server environment that you would want to do locally, because they are really fundamental to pretty much every web application. Sure. But at the same time, a lot of people want to use third-party services, same as like authentication. Yeah. So for instance, Redwood makes it really easy to integrate with a bunch of third-party authentication services like Auth0, Clerky. There's a bunch of them. And at the same time, you might very well say, I don't want to use any third-party service. I'd rather own all of my own user data and authentication capabilities, in which case we've built what we call DB auth, where you have a database, because I mean, that's what you're doing with Redwood to begin with. So we have you run a command line program, and it will set everything up for you. And now you have all of your authentication built into your own application that you can then modify from there as your heart desires to accomplish anything that you want. Now you have full control. So this is kind of the hybrid approach that we're after. Is you want to own that infrastructure, you want to own that capability, great, here's how you do it. And we have an official thing that will help you do that. But if you'd rather use a third-party service, or you're using a more serverless architecture, well, guess what? We're going to make that easy too. So we want to make both options possible. So we do that for auth. There's no reason that we couldn't or shouldn't do that for things like background jobs and mailers as well.
Sure. When someone's considering the tech stack right now, and you have, you know, RedwoodJS, and then you have like kind of like the myriad of other JavaScript frameworks that are a little bit more exclusively like, you know, front end, or lean maybe even harder on the, you know, Jamstack, you know, serverless architecture. What are some of the values that people get right out of the box choosing Redwood?
One of the biggest things that you'll get is a really sophisticated backend that is essentially a GraphQL API. And we've done a huge amount of work to make building a GraphQL API as easy as possible. So it's built on Apollo server, but you don't really interact with it directly. You create what we call services, and services look like just regular JavaScript or TypeScript files that export some named things. And if those names line up with the names of your resolvers, what your resolvers would normally be named in a certain way, then we'll connect them to the GraphQL service and expose them to the outside world. And we have built-in authentication capabilities there, so that everything is secure by default. You have a full authentication layer built into your GraphQL, so that you can say, for each resolver, for each endpoint, or each query or mutation that you would make via GraphQL, you can tell it to require auth, or you can tell it to skip auth for things that need to be publicly available. or you can have any kind of custom directive that you want that you're just putting right into your SDL file. And you can then hook that into the code that you write to make those authentication layers. So if you want to build a GraphQL API, I don't know of any better and easier and more enjoyable way to do it than using Redwood's backend. And this is something we see some people doing as well, is saying, I need a GraphQL API, but it's just going to service a mobile client or a command line utility or something. And they won't use Redwood's front end stuff at all. They'll just use Redwood to build the GraphQL API. And that's a fantastic way to use it. So I'd say one of the biggest differentiators for Redwood is that you get all the sophistication of GraphQL in a much easier to build kind of a way, and integrated with Prisma, obviously, to make that easy to do your sort of full stack backend piece. And then integrated with authentication, we have it integrated with Jest testing as well, along with scenarios to make it really easy. This is a testing facility that we've created on top of Jest to make it easy to put mock data into your database across multiple tables, and then test all of that inside a specific scenario, and then say, set up a scenario for a set of tests, and then tear it down and have a different scenario for a different set of tests. So it just makes it really easy to get your database into a specific configuration for the kinds of testing that you want to do. So this is all on the back end, and that allows you to have multiple clients. So from the very beginning, we wanted Redwood to be something that you could run any front end against. So your web application naturally, but also most startups are going to end up having some kind of a mobile client, which you're going to want to run against GraphQL. And this is exactly what we saw at Chatterbug when we were building it as a Rails app. It was a Rails app, but then we built a mobile application, and that was when we had to build the GraphQL API in addition to the Rails backend. So now we've got two backends, two ways to get at the data. And now you start getting differences between them, and you have to maintain two different ways to access your data depending on what the client is. And then you're sitting there thinking, like, my mobile application and my web application are both just clients. That why couldn't they both consume GraphQL? And so if you think that way and use a single page application architecture to have that be to make those capabilities work, then they're no different. And you are just multiple different clients talking to the same GraphQL API. And you can have as many clients as you need to, whether you're building an app for automobiles or a kiosk or anything. It's all just a single GraphQL API. So spend your time building up a really great GraphQL API and then consume it from as many front ends as you want.
That's amazing. And it sounds like one of the big values of Redwood is this decoupling. And I'm curious, for those that are worried that, like, oh, this sounds like a lot of stuff kind of all jammed into one place, how do you manage the different facets of the application inside of a Redwood app? So, you're like your web app, your backend client, et cetera, et cetera.
So right now it is a monorepo setup with multiple node and projects, essentially. Well, I guess the backend's node, the front end ends up being bundled with Webpack. We handle all that for you, right? You never have to look at a single line of Webpack configuration. Another great benefit of using Redwood, we've spent thousands of person hours configuring Webpack on your behalf so that you never have to. It's a nightmare. So it's a monorepo. So there's two right now. When you install a Redwood app, it creates the API folder, which is for the back end, and it creates a web folder, which is for your React-based front end. And then we use Yarn to be able to use workspaces to manage those. We're working on upgrading to Yarn 3, which is going to make a lot of things better. So that's kind of part of the 1.0 effort, is to make Yarn 3 a possibility to use. You won't have to use Yarn 3. You could still use Yarn 1 if you want, but Yarn 3 brings some of the PNP stuff so that you have a cache of all your stuff, so you're not having to re-download things every single time, which is a total nightmare. So, and there's guarantees around. It's just a better system. So anyway, we use Yarn for those workspaces, and that's been working pretty well. I think it's not perfect.
Sure.
nothing in the Node packaging universe is perfect, let's say. Understatement of the year, perhaps. I have several times asked the question, should we be building a package manager?
Interesting.
Which it's not something I want to ask. But when the available options are all really challenging, and I think this comes out of the challenges with JavaScript itself, JavaScript and TypeScript. JavaScript makes certain things difficult.
Yeah.
Packaging ends up being one of them. But it has been a real struggle, especially for contributors that want to come in and contribute to the framework. It's like, how do you spin up a web application and the framework in a way that you can edit the framework and then have those changes appear in the web app that you're using to test the framework? And that I've also spent thousands of man hours trying to solve, which we have, and we've done it's really nice. You can contribute to the framework quite readily now, and especially with Gitpod. So we use Gitpod now also. I'm getting off. I love it. Gitpod now allows you to take any pull request in the Redwood repository and spin it up and and that automatically spins up also a Redwood application. So you have a pull request in the Redwood framework repository, RedwoodJS /Redwood on GitHub. That's the framework. It'll create and spin up also a test project so that in that Gitpod instance, you can edit the framework and it is already set up to be using that instance of the framework instead of, real Node packages that you can't edit. So you edit the framework in that Gitpod instance and immediately your changes are reflected in the web application.
Wild.
So it's just a bunch of stuff that you would otherwise have to set up and run a bunch of commands to get your web application to use the version of the framework that you have on your disk. All of that happens through the automatic setup and configuration stuff in Gitpod. So it's really become very easy to review pull requests and then do experiments in that environment versus having to set it up locally, which is
a nightmare sometimes.
A total nightmare.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to go back to this notion of testing that you were talking about. And I know that was really big in the kind of like server full era of frameworks like Rails and Laravel. There was this kind of resurgence, or I guess maybe even the development of test driven development, and this idea of like, kind of like testing, from the edge, and then, kind of testing your whole stack, like kind of through this process of like going outside in or top down or, whatever. And I know that was like a big banner philosophy for communities of that time. And I'm really curious, with so much focus on the UI, specifically, I know you have this notion of cells where you have a component architecture that allows you to kind of automatically get, the error state, the pending state, and then like kind of your success state. I'm curious, you made this interesting decision to use Storybook in conjunction with your like testing harness to actually test those scenarios. And I'm curious, where do you see Storybook falling into the modern web development stack?
I'll tell you a dream that I've had for
Please.
many, many years. And this goes back even to the GitHub days. And that is the idea that you could develop and work on your front end in isolation from your back end. Which, if you work in a Rails environment, if you know Rails and you've done Rails for a long time, you'll know that that's very, very difficult to do or impossible. Like, how would you do that using the normal Rails techniques?
I don't even know how. I wouldn't even know where to start.
Right. It's really tightly coupled. The front end and the back end are very tightly coupled, and there's no way to substitute in fake data for your front end in order to be able to kind of feed it what you want. You end up developing in the application itself, and you're always trying to get your database into the state that you want in order to get your front end code, your view, to look like what you want it to look like for a given specific scenario, right? So a lot of your time is spent just wrangling the database or twiddling things in your user backend to try to get a user to look like what you want it to look like so that you can look at the thing on your page and have it be in a specific state, right? So this really bothered me back in the GitHub days. I found it just endlessly irritating that was the state of the art in working on your view layer in Rails. And so I saw a thing out of Google. I think it was called C tags at
Mm-hmm.
the time, and it was the syntax that was totally logicless, and it was it was a templating language, and it would replace things in your page according to you would give it a data structure. Basically, this was the idea: give it like a hash table, and it would then match those bits of data into the page, and it had ways to do looping. I think, even though that's kind of logic, it had this weird thing. Anyway, what I'm talking about might sound familiar. In fact, it's what Mustache is today, essentially. And the reason that that is that way is because I was talking to Chris Wanstroth, one of my co-founders at GitHub, about C tags at a bar one evening, about how I thought that was really cool, like this way that you could eventually someday be able to work on your front end, your view code in
Yeah.
isolation. That it would be like, oh, this is amazing because the way that you write your view is as a
Yeah.
template. And because it's a template and there's no logic, then you could just give it a hash and it knows how to render from a hash,
Mm-hmm.
essentially, right? Give it data and it knows how to render. It's a templating language without logic. And he thought that was cool. And he went home that night and he wrote Mustache. And Mustache comes from. And the ideas of a logicless template like derive from there through me having done no actual real work, but having that idea that it would be amazing,
Yeah.
right? So now Mustache has not really progressed past. I think Twitter used it
Mm-hmm.
quite a bit
Mm-hmm.
at one point, but that idea was good. But I think that that implementation of it did not pan out. It did not. It wasn't
Okay.
enough, right? It wasn't flexible enough. You actually really like having logic in your view. It
Sure.
turns out it's really hard to deal with a logicless templating language. It's really kind of a pain in the ass. And so then React came along, and I'm looking at React and I'm saying, this is everything that I
Yeah.
wanted in being able to feed a data structure essentially into a view component, something that's going to render, and be able to work on it in isolation. I don't need anything else because it takes in
Yeah.
props, right? Like, what do React components do? They take in props and they render out HTML minus context and
Sure.
and whatnot, right? So that complicates matters a little bit, but they're solvable. But essentially, you're giving it data and it's rendering. Okay, so this is something I've been after for more than a decade. And React finally makes it possible, but then you're saying, okay, well, that's true, but still, how do you instrument that? Like, how do you make that easy to wrangle? And then I saw Storybook several years ago now, right? Storybook has matured quite a
Yeah.
bit since then. But when we first started working on Redwood, and we were using Storybook within Chatterbug to do exactly this, to become a place where we could work on front end components in isolation. So you could, and I was doing this at Chatterbug. I was writing some front end code. I was writing React, and it was amazing to be in that environment and just say, all right, well, I'm going to build my component, and I'm going to be able to see it in isolation and feed it the props that I want, and put it just manually, like put it in any of these different setups so I can see every render. So we had a flag, a simple flag component that we would render everywhere. And that was it's a component that could take a bunch of parameters, and yeah, you want to see them all rendered out. And so you just iterate over the prop choices, and like, there you go. Right. And you can immediately see if one of them is rendering wrong or one of the flags is, off kilter a little bit. You don't have to go and change something in your database to see that. You just go look at Storybook, and here's your iterations of 10 different flags that you want to see. And the same was true of whole pages. I built entire pages of stuff that were all a single Storybook component that were then made of, a cascade of nested components, as one does in React. And it was all in Storybook. And I didn't, I built the entire thing that way. And then plop, I put it in the real app, and it worked. Like, I didn't, and it was, right.
Yeah.
I was done. Like, I hooked it up to the, to the GraphQL query and made sure that the right data was coming in. And the whole thing was done. And I never spent a single second in the database trying to get it into a state that it needed to be in for me to see some specific version of the output. And so I had finally achieved the dream that I'd had for a decade of being able to work in that way. And it's just, once you get into that mindset, once you start developing that way, Not only are you able to do that without all the hassle of getting your database into a specific state, but also you naturally, as a byproduct, have an amazing design resource for all of your designers and front end people to look through and say, is there a component in here that I can use for what I need? Like what does the avatar component look like and how do I use it? It's all documented and visualizable in Storybook. And if that is your flow, then you get that for free. Nobody ever has to sit down and be like, all right, I'm going to put together the design resource now, because the developers, the front end developers, have been doing it all along while they've been developing, because it's easier. And now you get the best of both worlds, and it's just glorious.
I couldn't agree more. And I'm curious from that, because I think we've talked about this from the perspective of teams, right? You know, you have someone who's working exclusively like on the front end and then like popping that in. And I think that I couldn't agree more. I think it's so nice to, I mean, database fiddling, the way that you put it is it was the worst part of every job that I've had before. Like, and you never know, like there's the thing that just feels icky at the time, but then you never know like what kind of problems you're causing for yourself later just by like changing this value to get this thing into that state. It's like, it's so frustrating.
Right. Exactly.
I'm curious, in this goal of taking someone from side project to startup, what would you say to that person who's kind of at that early stage and it feels like maybe too much of an ask to have this like separation? Because I think that's like, if you're just one person hacking, sometimes it's kind of nice to just we're doing it live, right? Like just do it on the view. But if you have that idea of going from side project to startup, kind of how does Redwood help you do that using Storybook?
Well, it's, you can choose to not use Storybook, for one, right? Like there's nothing that says you have to develop that way. But the thing is, I think eventually you will want to develop that way. You will want the capabilities of Storybook to be able to act as documentation, to be able to use as a develop in isolation kind of environment. Maybe you don't want it right away, and that's fine, right? Like don't use it. Or don't use your unit test. Like don't write them. Like there's no police going to come after you and say, as much as certain test-driven development advocates would like there to be, there is no police force that is mandated to track you down and punish you for not writing tests. So if you want to just experiment something out, just stub something out, like, go for it. Redwood doesn't get in your way. You can absolutely just do it live and reload. And sometimes that's easier and faster. But as you mature and as your side project becomes more of a startup, and especially if you start hiring people or you're working on a team of people, and double especially as you start to specialize and get people that are doing primarily front end or primarily back end work, being able to work in that kind of isolated environment and having tests available to you, you're going to really start to rely on them more. And you know what you don't want to do? Try to integrate Storybook and Jest as deeply as we have in order to get the really nice things out of it. Like these are not trivial endeavors to do well, right? And so if you can have someone do that integration work for you, you can save literally weeks or months of work. I mean, I could tell you stories about how long it has taken us to really elegantly integrate Jest and Storybook, and it is a significant amount of work. And out of the box now, you just get it, and it's there. And if you don't want it, you don't use it. But when you do, you run a single command, and it spins up your Storybook, and it'll work 100% every time, and all the work is done for you.
Well, one construct that y'all have in Redwood that just, I think, embodies the kind of like UI design challenge, like better than anything I've seen before, is that notion of the cell, and the way that when you generate your cells using the command, you actually get a Storybook that shows you these various states. And I feel like, I mean, honestly, like nothing has like better encapsulated this notion of timelessness that the React component is supposed to have as that model that you have. Because it's just, it very clearly slices up the time for you, instead of, I've seen so many tests that are like, oh yeah, do this, and then just wait for the modal to load, and it'll like kind of transition through these states. And it's like, no, like we have these components, and they can be rendered at various points in time. And, we do that for you, and we hook it up with Storybook, and we hook it up with Jest, and like, you don't have to do any of that stuff. Like that alone is just such a beautiful little cluster of things that exists in the Redwood world for me.
Yeah, the declarative nature of cells is really powerful, I think. And just in case a listener doesn't know, a cell is a way to declaratively do data fetching. So you have exports from a specific file, the cell file, where you're just exporting React components that represent your component in different states. So you'd have a state for success, obviously, that's the one that you're going for, but you also have states for failure and for loading, and optionally also for empty. If you want a separate empty state, then you just have it return, you export empty, and that's a React component. And then the framework handles the logic of the data fetching for you. So it'll run the data fetch on a GraphQL. You also export a GraphQL query. And the cell, when you embed it on your page and give it some props if necessary, will take that, it'll run the query with the variables, that you sent through or whatever. And then it will orchestrate through the various states on your behalf. And that allows you to not have to worry about that logic or put it in your component where you're normally doing like, well, if it's loading, then do this. And then if it failed, then do this, right? So you just have a lot of boilerplate logic in there that you're going to have to do a million times every time you do a data fetch. And it makes it hard to kind of separate them out and look at them. Like you're saying in Storybook. In Storybook, the Storybook entry for a cell has just listed, like, here's the failure state, and here's the success state, and here's the loading state. And you just click through them, and that's all they are, because they've just been exported as individual React components. And so that gives you both of those sides, this ability to develop in isolation in a very easy way, use Storybook as a design resource. You also get the declarative, kind of less messy version of data fetching. And it means that over time we can improve the logic of that data fetching and how it works to your benefit, even under the covers. So there's certain things like the waterfall problem, which we are still kind of wanting to optimize. So waterfall being, you have one GraphQL query that fetches some information, but then you have a nested component that needs something from that piece of data in order for it to do its data fetching. And so it has to wait for the parent component to fetch data before it can do its own fetching. And if you have a bunch of those nested deeply, now you're waiting for kind of multiple layers deep to do that. I'm looking forward to, after 1.0, thinking about these problems more deeply and trying to figure out ways to, can we statically analyze the GraphQL query so we can say, oh, this doesn't actually need to wait. There is no dependency here. Just kick off the parent and the child GraphQL queries simultaneously so that you don't have to wait for them, or another way to aggregate them. There's been some people have experimented with this kind of thing. And some of the new suspense stuff in React 18 has potential tie-ins to this. So we haven't had a chance to really dig in deeply to that. But at the framework layer, we might be able to do things in the framework that then when you upgrade, then it just magically works better because we control the fetching. And of course you could do the fetching yourself if you want. Like, you can use, if you only want success and you want to do all the logic yourself, like, we pass you everything that you need to use success in the normal way that you would, and you write all the logic in there. So you can still do it the old fashioned way. And this is another nice thing about Redwood is we really try not to pin you into some of these opinions. We make these things easy and available to you, but like, you don't have to do them. You could do them the old school React way without any of that help if you want to. And some people do to integrate with certain things, like React Table has its own certain way of thinking about data fetching, and you can use that, and it does its own GraphQL fetching in a slightly different way. And so that's not a problem. Like, you can do that. You're just not using some of the built-in data fetching that is going to make your life a little easier for the normal situation. You can always fall back to using Apollo directly if you want, like, whatever it is that you want to do, like, you can go deeper. It's just some of these patterns make your life a lot easier.
Well, it sounds like you've learned a lot of lessons kind of in the decades of experience you've had building full stack applications in really making sure that things are decoupled, opt-inable, so you can kind of do it the manual way just as easily, or opt into these kind of like new battle tested processes that you've been working through as a team. I know that you are doing a V1 launch week coming up, and that's super exciting. I think at the time that this airs, when you're watching this, it'll be maybe like a week from then. I think it's April 4th through 7th. Okay.
That's right. The week of
Nice.
April 4th is launch week. We will be doing things Monday through Thursday. That week we'll have a variety of exciting announcements and some things related to startups. We'll be doing a startup showcase where we already have a bunch of startups using Redwood. In fact, we've had almost $20 million of money
Wow.
raised
Amazing.
through companies that are using Redwood to build their startups. So we already have a vibrant ecosystem of people. We have a startup club that we do within sort of the preview of the Redwood community, where we invite anyone who's building a startup on Redwood to come in, and where we all learn from each other. And I can give advice, any advice that I have that's relevant for people. We get together every month and talk, and we're going to be building those aspects out as well to really foster the startup side of what Redwood is trying to do to offer help to people. We'll be going over a lot of partnerships that we're going to be announcing with people, all the different authentication and deployment providers, as well as a bunch of other people in the ecosystem. Storybook will be doing a lot of announcements around that and where Redwood fits into those various ecosystems. And it's just going to be a really fun week of announcements, and finally a Redwood 1.0 after 2 years since the very first initial launch of Redwood 0.1. It will be just over 2 years in the making since then. And it turns out, I didn't know this. Did you know this? Building a web application framework is actually really hard. I'm not sure if know that or not.
I had a suspicion. That's
it
why I've never
turns
tried.
Well, this was in my life. I have been trying to escalate the difficulty of projects that I work on, and so tackling a web application framework is actually one thing that I really wanted to work on. So I've finally been able to make that happen, and it is several orders of magnitude more difficult than I imagined that it would be.
Well, we're super excited to
it's quite hard.
celebrate the 1.0 mark, because and I know you've done a lot of work to make this a really seamless and elegant experience for startups, and so we're really excited on the Storybook side to just be a part of your launch week. Where do people go to find out more and to celebrate with you?
You can go to redwoodjs.com. That's probably the best place to start, or RedwoodJS on Twitter. Those are kind of the primary places to find us. You'll see all of the announcements and everything on Twitter. So if you're looking to follow along during that week, at RedwoodJS on Twitter is probably the most informative place that you can be. If you're interested in what you heard today and you want to check out Redwood a little bit more, I really suggest you do the tutorial.
Awesome.
It is now updated for 1.0. So it is brand new and includes all the new features that 1.0 has. So if you want to really get a taste for what Redwood can do the tutorial. It's quite comprehensive. It takes you through creating an application and all of the testing, Storybook, the data fetching with cells, everything that's special about Redwood, you get to experience in the tutorial. It's really
I did the first one for the earlier versions, and I'm really excited to go through it again for all the 1.0 features, because it sounds awesome. Sounds super awesome.
Yeah, and we've had a community of over 250 people that have helped make Redwood possible in the tutorial, and I hope to grow that community even bigger.
Well, hey, that's it for our episode today. Big thanks to Tom. Thank you so much for joining us to talk about the future of full stack frameworks. If you like this episode, let us know by hitting like. And if you want other episodes like this interview today, you can subscribe and hit notifications and leave us a comment. That's it. Thank you so much for watching, sticking through to the end, and we'll see you in the next one.